Thunder 3. The desert learned their names before the world ever would, because the desert always remembers blood and mercy longer than men do, and on that scorched afternoon, when the sun pressed down like a judge with no patience left, Caleb Rourke first saw the two Apache girls clinging to the shadow of a dead cottonwood, as if it were the last honest thing on earth. Their dresses torn, faces streaked with dust and tears, eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes only when childhood ends too early. And Caleb, a man hardened by gunsmoke, broken trails, and a past he never spoke about, knew in his bones that whatever trouble had driven them here had teeth sharp enough to follow. He was riding west with a herd contract, half-failed and a heart that hadn't beaten clean in years, his revolver heavy on his hip, his horse lathered and restless, when the smaller girl collapsed outright and the older one stepped in front of her with a knife that shook so badly it barely deserved the name. And Caleb stopped, because some debts are paid before they're earned, because sometimes a man recognizes the echo of his own lost youth in a stranger's terror, and because the desert went quiet. In that way it only does when something violent is close. He dismounted slowly, palms open, voice low, speaking words that weren't English at first, but broken. Apache phrases he'd learned from a woman long dead, enough to make the older girl hesitate, enough to let him see the bruises on their arms, the rope burns on their wrists, and the dried blood in the younger one's hair. He gave them water before asking anything, because thirst is a cruelty that never lies, and when they drank like it might vanish again, he heard hooves in the distance, fast and careless, the sound of men who believed the world owed them whatever they could take. Caleb hid the girls behind the cottonwood, lifted his rifle and waited, knowing already that mercy had chosen him and that it would not let go easily. 3 men came over the rise, sunburned, drunk on heat and confidence, laughing too loudly, eyes already searching the ground like hounds, and when Caleb stepped into view they smiled until they saw his stance, the calm in his shoulders, the fact that he wasn't afraid, because men like that can smell fear the way wolves smell blood. Words were exchanged, lies told, truth denied, and when one of them reached for his gun, Caleb ended the conversation with a single shot that cracked the sky and dropped the man where he sat, and the desert swallowed the sound as if it had been waiting. The others ran, not because they were cowards, but because they were smart enough to recognize a man who had already decided how far he would go, and Caleb stood there breathing hard, knowing the ripples of that moment would travel farther than any bullet. He took the girls with him, wrapped them in his coat, set them on his horse, and rode through the night toward a trading post he barely trusted, listening as the older girl. 2 to 3 finally spoke, telling him their names were Nalin and Taza, that their mother had sent them ahead when raiders came, that she had stayed behind to slow them, and that they had been running for 2 days without knowing if she lived. Caleb didn't answer right away, because he knew what it was to be left behind so others could survive. But when he did speak, he promised something he hadn't promised anyone in a long time, that as long as he breathed, they wouldn't be taken again. At the post, he bought passage with money he couldn't spare, threatened men who didn't deserve threats, and slept on the porch with his rifle across his chest while the girls slept inside, safe for the first time in days. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when regrets usually came to gnaw at him, he felt instead the strange, unsettling weight of purpose. He arranged for them to be taken to a mission farther east, a place where their mother might look first if she lived. And when the wagon rolled away, Nalin pressed something into his hand, a small bone charm, carved with symbols older than the map lines. Caleb followed and told him their mother would remember this, that debts traveled farther than bullets, and Caleb laughed it off because he didn't believe in ghosts or omens anymore, only in the math of survival. Weeks passed, then months, and the story of the cowboy who shot a man over 2. Apache girls traveled through saloons and camps, growing teeth of its own while Caleb rode on, trying to forget the eyes that had trusted him so completely, trying to outrun the sense that the desert had marked him, Then one evening, as a storm rolled in from the south and the sky bruised purple and black, a figure appeared at his campfire just beyond the ring of light, silent as judgment. And when Caleb looked up, hand on his gun, he saw a woman standing there wrapped in a weathered blanket, her hair streaked with ash and silver, her eyes dark and steady, holding the same bone charm he had left hanging by his bedroll. She spoke his name without asking it, thanked him for saving her daughters, and told him she had come to pay a debt that could not be carried by children. Her voice calm, almost gentle, and yet the fire hissed and the wind died as if the world itself leaned in to listen. She said the men he killed had brothers. That blood had been promised, that his path now bent toward a reckoning he could not see, and that she could not erase what was coming. But she could stand between him and the worst of it, if he would accept the cost. Caleb felt something colder than fear slide down his spine, because he had faced guns and knives and hunger, but never a debt spoken with such certainty. And as the first drops of rain struck the dust, he realized that saving 2 lives had bound him to a story far larger than his own. If you want to hear how that debt comes due, how the past reaches forward with both hands, and how mercy can demand a price steeper than violence, stay with this story. 3. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next, because Chapter 2 is where the desert collects what it is owed. The woman did not sit when Caleb offered, did not warm her hands at the fire, did not look away from him even once, and in that unwavering gaze, he felt the same pressure he used to feel before a gunfight. That narrowing of the world where choices shrink and consequences grow teeth. And when she finally lowered herself onto a rock just beyond the firelight, the storm paused, as if listening for permission, rain hovering in the air like a held breath. She told him her name was Ista, that she was the mother of Nalin and Taza, and that she had followed the trail of fear and blood for weeks to find him, not because he was hard to track, but because fate prefers to arrive late, when men have convinced themselves they are safe. Caleb listened without interrupting, because some stories demand silence, and as she spoke, the fire bent and snapped in the windless night, shadows moving like living things across the ground. Ista explained that the men he had killed were not simply drunks and slavers, but part of a loose brotherhood that traded in people the way others traded in cattle, that their reach extended farther than any single town, and that when blood was spilled, especially by a man who walked alone, it was remembered, counted, and eventually collected. She told him that the charm her daughter had given him was not a thank you, but a marker, a sign to those who knew how to read it that a life had been spared at great cost, and that the debt now ran both ways, binding the saver and the saved in a circle that could not be broken, only balanced. Caleb wanted to argue, to say he hadn't asked for any of this, but the truth lodged in his throat like a bone, because he had asked the moment he chose to stop, the moment he chose mercy over distance. Ista said she had already paid once, staying behind to slow the raiders, spilling blood of her own, calling in favors owed to her by men and spirits alike, and that those favors were now exhausted, leaving only one path forward. The Brotherhood was moving west, following whispers of a cowboy who had made an example of their kin, and they would not stop until they found him or something that satisfied their hunger for balance. And she had come to offer him protection, not as a gift, but as a trade. She would walk with him for 3 days, guide him through land that did not appear on maps, and in return, when the time came, he would not refuse what she asked, no matter how heavy it felt. Caleb stared into the fire and saw faces there, men he had buried, women he had left behind, a younger version of himself, who still believed the world could be outrun. And he nodded because some bargains are struck the moment they are spoken, because refusing would not change what was already in motion. They broke camp before dawn, moving through ravines and stone corridors where sound died quickly, Ista walking ahead with the certainty of someone following a path laid down long before footprints existed. And as the days passed, Caleb noticed things he could not explain, tracks that vanished abruptly, vultures that circled wide but never descended, distant riders whose silhouettes blurred and dissolved when watched too closely. On the second night, gunfire cracked the dark from behind them. Shots too far to aim but close enough to warn, and Ista did not flinch, only quickened her pace, leading Caleb into a canyon where the walls rose like clenched fists and the moon disappeared entirely. There, she stopped and told him the truth she had been holding back, that the debt she spoke of was not merely protection, but inheritance, that by saving her daughters, Caleb had stepped into a role left empty by a man who died years ago, a man who once stood between her people and annihilation, and that the balance now demanded a replacement. Caleb felt anger then, sharp and sudden, because he had never wanted to belong to anything again, because belonging meant loss when it inevitably broke. But before he could speak, the canyon erupted with shouts and hooves, torches flaring at both ends, the brotherhood finally revealing itself like a wound torn open. There were more men than Caleb could count quickly. Rifles raised, faces hard with certainty, and for a heartbeat the old instinct screamed at him to draw, to take as many as he could before falling. But Ista stepped forward, lifting her hands, and the night bent around her words as she spoke in a language older than the guns aimed at her. The men hesitated, some lowering their weapons despite themselves and their leader, a tall man with scars like tally marks on his neck, laughed and said debts were paid in blood, not in stories. Ista turned to Caleb then and said it was time, that this was the weight she had warned him about. And before he could ask what she meant, she took a blade from her belt and pressed it into his hand, guiding his grip, closing his fingers around it with a strength that surprised him. She told him that the Brotherhood would never stop hunting him as a lone man, but they would hesitate to hunt a symbol, that the balance demanded a living reminder of what happens when innocence is threatened, and that reminder could not be hers anymore because she had already given everything else. Caleb understood then, too late to stop it, that the debt she had come to pay required a sacrifice no bullet could replace. And when the leader stepped forward to seize her, Caleb moved not in anger but in acceptance, the blade flashing once, twice, a precise violence that ended the man's laughter forever. Chaos followed. Shots fired, men shouting, but something had shifted, fear creeping in where certainty once lived. And as Caleb fought his way out of the canyon with Ista's final words echoing in his head, protect them, remember who you are, now he felt the weight settle on his shoulders like a mantle he could not shrug off. By dawn, the Brotherhood was scattered, their leader dead, their myth cracked, and Caleb stood alone among the rocks, blood on his hands that did not feel like his own, understanding that survival had taken something from him this time that would not heal. He found the mission days later thinner, quieter, older in ways that had nothing to do with years. And when Nalin and Taza ran to him, alive and laughing, he knelt and held them, swallowing the truth of what their mother had paid, knowing that some debts are honored best by silence. Caleb stayed, not as a cowboy passing through, but as a guardian who understood the cost of mercy, teaching, watching, standing between danger and the fragile future those girls represented. And as word spread of a man who did not kill for pride, but for protection, the desert adjusted around him, storms breaking early, trails opening when needed, balance slowly restored. This is the kind of story the world forgets too easily, the kind where courage costs more than life and debts, are paid not with gold, but with becoming something larger than yourself. And if this story moved you, if you want to hear more tales where sacrifice matters and mercy leaves scars, make sure you stay connected to the channel, because stories like this don't end, they wait to be remembered.